When I was young, I used to dream about a man I could swear I'd never met. I made drawings of his face, but they never matched my dreams. As I grew up, I started to get used to him. He kept appearing in my dreams from time to time, but I stopped paying attention to it. Until a couple of months ago when everything changed. I had moved back with my parents to the town I was born in, and after a while, he started visiting my dreams again, all the time. I would never get rid of this stalker. He was inside my head. When I talked to my mom about it, she told me not to pay attention to it. If he was only in my dreams, then he wouldn't harm me. The other day, I was coming out of school, and I felt that someone was staring at me. I looked instinctively and saw him on the other side of the parking lot. I got goosebumps. I turned around to tell my friend, but when I looked again, he was gone. Was I going crazy? We went to the mall, and I saw him behind every column and inside every shop. But when I looked closely, he disappeared. My friend got really worried about me too. She couldn't see him. I was definitely going crazy. That night, the real nightmare began. I went to bed knowing that I would dream about him, but I wasn't ready for what was actually waiting for me. I was in an open square and I was completely alone. I looked around and saw him approaching, but when I tried to move, nothing happened. This was new. I was stuck in my place, frozen like a statue, as he started to walk towards me. I could feel it tickling in my arms and my legs as I tried to turn around and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't move a muscle. I don't know why. I was paralyzed. The man got closer and closer, and I could feel my heart racing. He didn't look mad or dangerous, but he didn't look kind either. His face had no expression. As he got really close, he stretched his arm to touch me. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone too. A second before he touched me, I got up screaming and sweating. My parents ran into my room and hugged me. "Are you all right?" my mom asked. I couldn't move, was all I could say. The next day, my dad drove me to school. I struggled to get out of the car. I was trembling, looking around everywhere, terrified that I might see the monster in my dreams. My dad saw my tears coming down and sighed. We went back home. My mom asked what happened as she saw us, and Dad said that this was not okay, that something was very wrong. I was already drenched in sweat, and I hadn't seen the man once yet that day. We went to the doctor. I knew what kind of doctor it was. A shrink, the one for the crazy people. But I didn't mind. I was ready to accept I was crazy as long as he freed me from my nightmare. I wasn't as concerned about the man as I was of the fact that I couldn't move. I was used to seeing the man, but this was new and it scared me to death. After he heard the story, he simply shot me with the news. Sleep paralysis. What? But he told me not to worry. It had a solution. That was good news. He said that the main treatment was to improve sleeping habits, like going to bed at the same time every night, ensuring a comfortable sleep environment, and avoiding caffeine before sleeping. But I was too scared to sleep. As night came, I was truly tired. I followed the advice of the doctor, and Mom said she would stay with me that night. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep, but just as fast, I was in a nightmare again. This time it was an empty room. No windows, no doors. The man and I were alone in there. And again, I was paralyzed. What would my muscles serve inside a sealed room anyway? But the sole feeling of not being able to move was frustrating. I felt my heart racing again as the man started to walk towards me. Mom said she was going to stay with me, but where was she? I looked around. I was alone. Scared to death, I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't even open my mouth. He was getting closer and closer. The face was always the same, but it felt more and more terrifying. He moved his arms to grab me, and I woke up with a huge scream. My mom hugged me and told me it was okay, but it was not okay. I was horrified. So we went to the doctor again. I asked him why this was happening to me, and after a few sessions without answers, he said that sometimes sleep paralysis is a result of a childhood unresolved trauma. But I didn't remember anything bad while growing up. He explained that it was surely something from my very first years. Sometimes traumatic memories go directly to our unconscious. We don't remember them, but they show themselves later on in life, in different experiences that provoke similar feelings. So what he was saying was that somehow after I was born, I went through a frightening experience, and my brain was now trying to get it out. Since, of course, I had no memory of those days, I asked my parents about it, but they said that they didn't remember anything. I went to bed praying to every god out there to please, for once, let me sleep without these nightmares. I wish I could say that my prayers were heard, but they weren't. In this dream, the setting was worst of all, my own room. It was the only place that this anonymous man never touched, and now I wasn't even safe in here. Lying down in my bed, I tried to move with no luck. The man was standing in the corner, staring at me without moving. For a moment, it was like a picture, and then it turned into a movie, a sick, terrifying one. He started to walk towards me in slow motion. Inside me, I was screaming and shaking and kicking. On the outside, I was as still as a statue. Please, don't hurt me. Please, please. But it was only a thought. The words couldn't come out. He got closer and closer, and I suddenly stopped trying to move and shout. I simply closed my eyes, waiting for the worst. I was too tired after 3 nights in a row with no rest. I gave in, and this time he touched my shoulder. But as nothing else happened, I opened my eyes. He just stood there, with his hand on my arm. I've never seen him as closely as that. My fear towards him never let me, and for the first time in my life, I could pay attention to the details on his face. I knew this man. I didn't have any memory of him, but I was sure I knew him. It was suddenly annoying not being able to place him. He extended his other arm very slowly and grabbed my other arm. And before I could do anything, he shouted, "Wake up!" I sat on my bed screaming. My mom entered the room and hugged me again. I freed from her embrace, still feeling the man's arms touching me. I stood up and went to my closet. I grabbed a box where I had my old drawings. I sat behind my desk and started to add details to the drawings. His face was still fresh in my memory, and I needed something from the real world to hold on to. As Mom got closer to me, the most bizarre thing happened. She took the drawing out of my hand and stared at it, with tears in her eyes. "You know this man?" I asked her, shocked, but she was paralyzed, shaking. How did we switch places so fast? "Mom!" I shouted, but she was speechless, shocked. I yelled for help and my dad ran inside the room. We put her on the bed and she breathed heavily, tears still falling on her cheeks. She looked at my dad and said she was sorry, that she could not hide the secret any longer. "What? What secret?" My dad stood silent. And so, Mom said, "I think the man in this drawing is your real dad." What the hell? She said she was sorry, that she held the secret to keep me safe, but now I was suffering anyway and she couldn't take it anymore. "Your real father left us one day without giving explanations," Mom said, "and I met your dad Bernard shortly after. I was desperate. You were 2 months old. He took care of us ever since." "Oh, Dad," I said and hugged him. He apologized and so did Mom. How could I not forgive them when they'd been nothing but loving parents? Still, I knew that the truth was not enough. I would have to confront him. I was not that little baby anymore, and I needed answers. I asked my parents if they knew something about him, if he was still alive. Mom said she heard he was living in a close town, but knew nothing more. I Googled him, and he appeared immediately. So many different pictures of him that my blood ran cold. It was definitely the man in my drawings, and apparently he had no intention of keeping a low profile. He was a criminal. He'd abandoned his family for no reason, and the pictures showed he was living his life freely, just like that. I wouldn't be surprised if he had a new family. It was such a cliché. I found his address quickly too. The close town Mom said was in fact the next town, just minutes away from home. I was determined. I was going to face him the next day. Mom couldn't convince me otherwise, so Dad said he wouldn't let me go alone. I didn't sleep much that night, thinking about the man. What would I say to him? Would he recognize me? The answers floated in the air as I fell asleep. I couldn't believe my eyes when it was the sun through the window that woke me up and not a horrifying nightmare. I guess half of the truth was enough to get me through the night. But I knew that if I didn't find the other half, the nightmares would stalk me again. I could see in my dad's expression he was still not convinced about this, but he respected my wishes and drove me to his house. We parked in front of his house, and I couldn't believe how close to home he lived. I must have passed through that street a million times in my life. I stayed inside the car for a long time before I could find the will to move. Dad told me he had my back, but I asked him to wait in the car. I got out and walked towards the house in panic. I didn't want to, but I knew there was no other way. I knocked on the door and waited for what seemed like hours. Finally, he opened the door. I was paralyzed again. I couldn't speak. "Yes?" he asked, with that same expressionless face he had in my dreams. He didn't recognize me, but then again, how would he? I started to cry, and with the only thread of air I had left, I whispered, "Dad?" He opened his eyes in shock, and his face turned to stone. "Get off my property." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. It was my nightmare all over again. I was paralyzed. "Get out," he insisted. I swallowed my questions and my pride and nodded, completely heartbroken. I turned around but couldn't even take 2 steps before I fell down. My dad got out of the car and ran towards me. I cried in his arms on the other side of the door for a long moment and then stood up. Mom had been right to keep me safe from this man. We started to walk towards the car when I heard the door opening. I looked at him and his face was transformed. "I believe I do owe you an explanation," he said, and invited us in. And then he said he was sick, that he'd been sick for years. Who the hell stays away from his loved ones in a moment like that? He said that his first thought was that he would die quickly, so he decided to keep it to himself. The doctor said no more than 6 months, so he went away so we wouldn't suffer. Months passed and then more months, but he didn't die. Fear turned to despair and then to frustration. And then it was too late. I started to grow up, and Mom met Bernard, and she was on her feet again. When he found out that I thought Bernard was my father, he felt like there was no place for him in my life. It wasn't fair to ruin the good life Mom and I had, and he gave up. He also admitted that he did follow me around for a while until I was 5 or 6 years old. I was not that crazy. But then he stopped that too, thinking that perhaps it would be frightening for me. He had no idea. It made me sad to think about this man now. Because he was going to die, he'd lived a life of death. No feelings, no relationships, no love. He had no one. I realized that no matter how much I'd suffered, my pain was nothing compared to his. I hugged him. What else could I do? He didn't deserve to spend his last days alone. He finally passed away a few months later. I tried to spend as much time as possible with him during that time. And although he couldn't make up for the lost years, he did have the chance to feel a bit of love before he went away. I had all sorts of mixed up feelings after that. I regretted his life decisions, and I know now he did too. It was as if karma wouldn't let him die until he made up for his mistakes. But I'm also glad that he didn't go alone. That's the most important lesson I've learned from him. Don't let bad decisions ruin your life. There's always time for forgiveness.